So let's say we want to go and create a new assessment. You're going to do that by going into Tools and Manage Assessments. And when you're in Manage Assessments, you can see all the existing assessments, the assessment dates and whatnot. So let's say we want to add a new one. We're going to go on the top right here and click Create Assessment. From in here, you can go and choose an assessment name. Let's say we're getting ready for the 2020 NIST 800-171. We can choose what group we want it in. So let's say we want it to say in here in the XYZ Corp. Let's say it's 2020 January. And then there's a number of key dates. Now none of the only ones that are really required are the start date and the end date. All these other ones are more about the process in making sure when it comes to reporting, when it comes to status information, it's using our standard, industry standard, best practice in terms of assessment processes. Which it is very generally is you typically have an assessment start date and an assessment end date, the very beginnings and very ends of the assessment. Pretty much if right before any particular kickoff meeting, pretty much right when the maybe even the contract gets signed or when you decide to have an assessment. And then the assessment end date is pretty much when we close the book on the assessment. It's after all the findings are sent, etc. So let's say we're going to create this assessment start date for December 25th. We have a new assessment coming up. And then you have this DRL. DRL is Document Request List. So typically with an assessment, what happens is you go and before you begin the assessment, you normally give a list of documents you want. Maybe a network diagram, you want an inventory list, maybe you want their previous assessment, a list of users, things like that. So typically the way the process works is you're going to go and you're going to give them that list. So in here is when you give them that list of information that you want. Maybe December 31st. It's usually fairly early after the assessment start date. It's usually one of the first things that comes out of beginning the assessment. And then you have a DRL end date. We want to make sure that when you're doing an assessment, yeah, you're requesting documents, but there needs to be pretty much a date in which, a due date in which all these documents need to be in by. So let's say January 12th. So that is pretty much when we're telling the auditee, this is when all the documents need to be in, and after that we're going to begin the actual audit. So the audit is essentially the equivalent of for some people it's the in-person interview of the stakeholders. Other assessments, it might be over the phone. It could even be more internal work, but this is really when you go in there and yeah, you receive the documents, but then you're doing the audit proper, the official audit. Usually an assessment takes many weeks. An audit is that piece in the middle where you're really gathering most of the information, getting your clarification, questions answered, etc. Usually that's a few days. So let's say the audit start date is the 13th and the audit end date is the 17th. And then you have what's called the DRL cutoff date. So inevitably, no matter what you ask the auditee in terms of what documents they need to provide, either they didn't provide them all, or as a result of the audit and maybe some back and forth clarifications, you realize you need some additional documents. Maybe they forgot to give it to you, or based on some answers, you need some additional clarifying documents. So this is where we have this DRL cutoff date. The DRL cutoff date is essentially the last date that we want to say that we're willing to accept documentation for this assessment. Because after that, the assessor needs to go and use all this information, determine their findings, and create a remediation plan or a corrective action plan. And that's really where this draft poem date is. The draft poem date is the date in which the corrective act, some people call it a corrective action plan, some people call it POAMs, plan of actions and milestones, some people call it remediation plan, findings remediation, things like that. So this is when, as an auditor, we're saying we're going to have these draft POAMs or draft remediations document done. So let's say we'll give that a week or so after the DRL cutoff date. And that's why that DRL cutoff date is so important, because you need that information to in the end, determine what findings and what remediation efforts need to be done. And then you have the assessment end date. The assessment end date is, again, pretty much when you deliver that final report in whatever form it is. So it's usually fairly quickly after that draft poem date, maybe less than a week or whatnot. And then you'll go and create, and you'll click the create assessment. Now again, the only things that are truly required is the assessment start date and the assessment end date. Everything else here in the middle is information that's used for reporting and things like that. You can do without it, but you're going to often be missing a lot of key indicators if you don't have them. So I click create assessment, and the assessment is created, and you can see in here January 2020 NIST 800-171.